Imagine a world where two nuclear-armed nations locked in a decades-long conflict come to the brink of war. The stakes are high, and the potential consequences are absolutely devastating. 1 to 2 million casualties, a nuclear winter, widespread hunger, and a dramatic drop in global temperatures. This is the reality for India and Pakistan, as tensions continue to simmer in the disputed region of Kashmir. So join us today as we delve into the history of this complex and volatile situation, examining the forces at play and the potential outcomes if peace talks fail. Will the two nations come to a resolution, or will they be forced to engage in a war that could change the course of history? We'll find out today in our in-depth exploration of India and Pakistan's ongoing conflict. To many, a war between India and Pakistan isn't just a hypothetical. Some view it as inevitable. That's because although the two countries have only existed independently for just over 75 years, they've already gone to war with each other on 4 separate occasions, and that doesn't even include the many smaller border skirmishes that resulted in the deaths of thousands. However, because both nations have grown and advanced considerably in the last few decades, if a modern-day war were to erupt between India and Pakistan, it now has the potential to be one of the most devastating conflicts ever. The modern conflicts of this region begin right after World War II, and like so many other conflicts, it all stemmed straight from the British Empire. At this point in time, most of South Asia was regarded as a single territory, British India, an absolutely massive colony that was under the administration of the British Raj. During the war, Britain had agreed to give British India its independence once the war was over, and when the time came, they were actually ready to follow through with their promise. But granting independence was much easier said than done. The real issue was that British India wasn't just comprised of one nation of people that had been colonized. In fact, there were dozens of ethnicities and languages throughout the region, and the British feared that this could lead to infighting and just general chaos if the area was left on its own overnight. And while working through possible solutions to this, it became clear that the biggest issue facing an independent British India wasn't language or culture, but religious tension, specifically between the large populations of Hindus and Muslims. Basically, the consensus among the minority Muslims was that without British rule, they would be the subject of discrimination at the hands of the majority Hindus, and the opinion of many Hindus was that the Muslims would riot and revolt in an attempt to gain power wherever they could. The fear that this would all spiral into an outright civil war was all too real, especially since this tension had already been building between the groups for decades, and a civil war would be bad news, not just for the hundreds of millions of people involved, but also for Britain, who was banking on becoming an ally with their former colony. Finally, a solution was brought to the table. Partition. The plan was to divide this territory into 2 separate groups, giving Muslims and Hindus their own independent nations. This plan was implemented in the summer of 1947, having been launched a year earlier than originally anticipated, and it made some major changes to the region. Now, there were 2 separate domains, the domain of India for the Hindus and the domain of Pakistan for the Muslims, split into 2 sections, West and East Pakistan. The border was drawn up on what was called the Radcliffe Line, carved into maps where the British thought it would be best, which, as we'll soon find out, was not very good at all. The first issue arose immediately. What were you supposed to do if you woke up on the morning of the partition and found yourself in the wrong dominion, say a Muslim now in the domain of India? Well, no worries. This had been anticipated. You'd simply gather your family, pack some bags, and move across the border to a new country. Now, this was all part of what was called the Mountbatten Plan. Draw a line where it best separates the religions, and anyone left behind is free to move over the border as soon as they'd like. Now, this might have gone over a little more smoothly if there were just a few outliers left on either side of the line, but there weren't just a few outliers. There were millions of people, and as they all began migrating across the border, chaos erupted, and violence on an unprecedented scale was unleashed. Violence against men, women, and children perpetrated by both sides so suddenly and so intensely that no outside force had the time or really the ability to put an end to it. And by the end, more than 1 million people were dead. Estimates place the total number of migrants at well over 10 million, with some even going higher than 20 million. Now, this number can seem a bit underwhelming when compared to more than 1 billion people that live in India today, but 20 million migrants would be the equivalent of the combined populations of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And it is these huge numbers that have earned the partition of India a place among the worst refugee crises in all of history. And the worst part was that the partition didn't even really solve the issue. Just a few months later, in autumn 1947, the new dominions of India and Pakistan went to war for the first time, fighting for control of the disputed province of Kashmir and Jammu. This was the first Kashmir War, which resulted in nearly 30,000 casualties and a line of control, or LOC, roughly dividing the disputed region. But this was far from a permanent solution, and by 1965, the Second Kashmir War was underway, this time turning into a massive conflict, leading to the destruction of hundreds of tanks, dozens of airplanes, and tens of thousands of casualties. Despite both sides claiming the victory, by the time the UN ceasefire was implemented, there were no territorial changes. The third war between the two powers came just 6 years later, in 1971, when East Pakistan declared its independence from the West, becoming the country of Bangladesh. Pakistan launched a series of preemptive airstrikes on India once they learned that the Indian military was assisting in the revolution in East Pakistan, and India responded in full force with combat on land, in the air, and at sea. Once again, the fighting resulted in thousands more casualties before it was over, although this war is unique in the fact that Pakistan actually ordered an official surrender. So that's already 3 wars in the bag, but there's more. Skirmishes along the border continued nearly every year for the next couple of decades, until in 1999, Pakistani troops crossed the line of control disguised as Kashmiri insurgents, sparking yet another conflict, this one called the Kargil War. Only a few thousand casualties emerged from the battle, but this was perhaps the scariest war of them all, as it could now be described not only as a war between India and Pakistan, but as a war between two nuclear powers. The stakes had never been higher, and perhaps that's why each country was a bit hesitant to go all out. But that hesitancy has been steadily eroding in the 20 years since, and with every passing year, there are more and more chances for the next big war to light the fuse. As you can imagine, the disputed province of Kashmir is still the likely culprit for the next war, though it's not the only one. Throughout the 21st century, there have been several terror attacks carried out on Indian soil, many of which India has traced back to Pakistani intelligence operations, though Pakistan denies this. One such attack, a bombing of the Indian parliament in 2001, led to both sides piling up tens of thousands of troops in Kashmir, ready to attack at a moment's notice. The world held its breath as peace talks were brokered, and fortunately, each side agreed to calm the situation and withdraw their armies, but not before a few hundred were killed in minor skirmishes. Another standoff happened a few years later, after the 2008 Mumbai Attacks. These were a series of bombings that took the lives of 175 people and wounded more than 300 others. After the lone surviving attacker revealed that the group responsible was a Pakistani Islamist terror group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, India once again accused Pakistani intelligence of funding the operation and began amassing forces in Kashmir. Pakistan, of course, responded similarly, and the two armies were staring each other in the eyes once again. This time, the brink of war was as close as ever, with some US senators even calling for a joint US-Indian invasion of Pakistan as part of the ongoing war on terror. Both air forces were placed on maximum readiness and deployed to frontline air bases. Tens of thousands of troops were near the front line, and both leaders were in constant communication with their nuclear command teams. Private intelligence from Stratfor even noted that Pakistan already prepared detailed forward operations and were merely awaiting the green light, and even the terrorist organization that was responsible for the attacks claimed that they had hundreds of operators with bomb vests ready to go at a moment's notice. Once again, the situation was eventually diffused, but it showed just how easily the tension can snap. In the event of a terror attack similar to the scale of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, India could very well respond with a show of military force that could quickly turn into all-out war. The next most likely cause of war would be either side encroaching once again in Kashmir. But this one is a bit more complicated than it was the first time around, as China also administers a part of the disputed region, about 30% of it. If either side pushed over the line of control or funded insurgencies on the other side, they would have to be careful not to awake the dragon that's sleeping next door. The conflict in Kashmir seems like it's only going to get worse in the coming years, as there are increasing reports that the Taliban plans to arm and fund Islamist militants in the disputed state. Kashmir is also responsible for another disagreement between the two nations, and that's with regard to water. Various river tributaries are claimed by both sides in a debate that should have been settled by the Indus Water Treaty of 1960, which allocated the water equally between each nation, but Pakistan alleges that India has broken this treaty with its recent dam construction. The final reason for a possible conflict could come as a result of civil war in Pakistan. Pakistan is recently in an incredibly unstable political state, with their prime minister receiving a no-confidence vote in April of 2022 and surviving an assassination attempt later in the year. This instability is fueled by rampant terrorism, sky-high inflation, and systematic corruption among military leaders. There is a big fear that if Pakistan collapses, it will turn into a sort of nuclear Somalia. Something of this magnitude could easily see an Indian military incursion to secure Pakistan's nuclear arsenal before it falls into the wrong hands and is either used or sold to a foreign buyer, such as Iran. If a war breaks out in the near future, which side is going to have the advantage? Well, let's start by comparing their air forces. As of early 2023, India fields around 650 fighter jets, while Pakistan has a bit less at around 450. But it's not just the numbers that make a difference here, it's the quality of the aircraft, as India has more than 200 Su-30s, an exceptional Soviet-designed multi-role fighter, as well as more than 100 MiG-21s and a few dozen French-made Rafales. Pakistan, on the other hand, will be relying on just a few dozen American-made F-16s, which, while they are highly capable aircraft, are not modernized in the Pakistani Air Force. The bulk of Pakistan's air force is made up of Chinese fighter jets such as JF-17s and F-7s, which are going to have a tough time competing with the Indian Air Force. India also has the upper hand when it comes to transport aircraft, crucially including hundreds of transport helicopters, which will allow for men and supplies to be moved through the highly mountainous terrain that separates the two countries. On the ground, India's tank infantry is mainly comprised of old Soviet T-72s, but in the last decade or so it has seen a huge influx of T-90 imports, a newer Russian tank. India has over 1,000 T-90s and has already placed orders for a few hundred more, as well as upgrades for them. Pakistan is fairly outmatched in the tank realm, fielding Chinese refits of old Soviet designs and a few hundred T-80s that it purchased from Ukraine in the 1990s. This lack of firepower means that Pakistani armor will have to stay on the defense, as facing the Indian tanks in direct combat risks losing hundreds. As far as active personnel go, India once again takes the cake, with 1.4 million, making it the largest volunteer army on the planet, whereas Pakistan has around 600,000 active personnel. India also outguns Pakistan in terms of towed artillery, multiple rocket launch systems, and overall defense budget. India's navy is far more powerful than Pakistan's, with 10 destroyers compared to 0, and India being the only one with an aircraft carrier. At the end of the day, India has the clear advantage, but this doesn't mean that Pakistan isn't going to put up a hell of a fight, and if India plays their cards wrong, things could go south very quickly. After the 2008 Mumbai Attacks, the Indian military was unable to respond militarily to Pakistan, despite many wishing for such a response. This is because by the time India gathered their forces on the border, Pakistan had already assumed defensive positions, and India would have taken significant casualties if they'd pushed on. This is why, following the standoff, India rewrote its military doctrine for a war with Pakistan. Currently, their known strategy is called Cold Start, which involves keeping a significant force near the border at all times. If a similar terror attack happens again in the near future, India is able to immediately respond with a spearhead advance into Pakistan. The idea is to slice so deeply and so quickly into Pakistani territory that strategic goals can be achieved before the international community steps in to call for a ceasefire and before Pakistan has a chance to use tactical nuclear weapons. Studies have put various estimates out for a direct conflict between the two powers, with 1 to 2 million casualties being the bare minimum if each country fully commits their armed forces, with many of these casualties coming from missile strikes in densely populated Indian cities. But simply due to the fact that both countries are nuclear powers, a war here has the potential to kill not just millions, but billions. A study at Rutgers University found that even a small-scale nuclear exchange would instantly kill 125 million people, and in the weeks afterward lead to the deaths of nearly 2 billion. The researchers arrived at these conclusions by estimating the effects on crop yields, freshwater supplies, climate, and animal products. Because this region of the world is responsible for so much of the world's food production, especially concerning rice, cereals, and sugar, hunger would spread throughout the supply chain like a wildfire. This would have absolutely devastating effects on countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Sri Lanka. They all rely heavily on India to feed their population, and it would also disrupt the food market on a global and unprecedented scale. Another effect of nuclear war would be the inevitable nuclear winter. If the two countries detonated a significant portion of their warheads, it would release an estimated 37 million tons of soot into the atmosphere, which could plunge global temperatures by several degrees Celsius to temperatures potentially not experienced since the last ice age. When all is said and done, another Indo-Pakistani war is unlikely to have a victor now that nuclear weapons are on the table, and perhaps that's why we can rest easy knowing that it won't likely happen soon. Unless India is confident they can steamroll their neighbor before things escalate, the situation is likely going to remain a tense standoff until the various disputes are resolved, which doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Thank you for watching.